It was Jerome's first day at his new school. He had moved over during the summer break and was looking forward to a fantastic school year. His parents had suffered a nasty divorce, and he had moved to New Orleans with his mother, who had sole custody. He had a lot of expectations for the new year. He was going to make many friends and stop being a nerd. "Are you going to be okay?" his mother asked as they pulled into the school driveway. For the 100th time, he nodded. McKinney High was more significant than his old school, but it was just a school, right? She kissed him goodbye, and he hurried out of the car without a wave. He rushed towards the trooping students headed into McKinney High. At 15, Jerome was tall and skinny with ginger hair. He was still undergoing puberty and had acne scattered all over his face. He had a tub of sunscreen in his bag and, under his mother's supervision, had put a decent amount on his face before they left the house. He stared around the hallway eagerly and in excitement. He had Googled a lot about his new school, which had twice the size of his old school student body. "Watch where you're going, punk," a chubby girl said, pushing him aside. "Sorry," Jerome quickly apologized as he held on to his school bag. He looked around for a smiling face, but it was the first day of school, and everyone was on and about. And then he spotted a smiling face, a tall guy just like him with ginger hair. How cool was that? Just as Jerome headed for him, something crazy happened. Two big dudes began to punch him. Everyone else ignored what was happening, making their way around the commotion. Jerome hurried over to him. "Hey, stop it!" He waved his lean hands. The two dudes let go of the guy. "Who the hell are you?" the bigger boys said. "You are hurting him," Jerome said, pointing at the boy with blood coming from his nose. "What is going on here?" a slender woman with a stern look asked. "We wonder the same thing, Miss Agatha. We found Jacob beating up this guy," the other guy said, pointing at Jerome. "Who, me?" Jerome said, stunned. "Is that right, Jacob?" Miss Agatha asked Jacob, who sat on the floor. The two bullies looked at Jacob. Jerome's eyes widened when Jacob nodded. "What? He didn't even know any of them. This was his first day in school." "That's not true. They were the ones beating him up," Jerome defended. A few minutes later, he found himself at the principal's office. The principal, Mr. Scott, was a busy man, as he told Jerome. He didn't like to waste his time on frivolous matters. He stared at Jerome disapprovingly. "I didn't do anything, I swear," Jerome defended himself. It was ridiculous that he would bully a kid on the first day. Who would even believe that? "Then who did it?" the principal asked, hands on his waist. "I told you who did it. The two boys did it. I am new here." "Why did you transfer schools? I am thinking about a bad record with violence, huh?" the principal asked with an intense stare. "Why I transferred here is none of your business," Jerome blurted out. He did not want pity from anyone when he told them they had moved here after his parents divorced. "Then I'm going to have to call your mother," the principal said. 20 minutes later, his mother showed up. She was not pleased to learn that her son had gotten into a fight on his first day of school. It was not even break time yet. "Ours is a school of discipline and integrity. If he's to stay here, he has to adhere to the rules of our beloved school," the principal said with a bored expression. "I assure you, Mr. Scott, he's going to behave. Right, Jerome?" his mother said with a stern look. "Right," Jerome said. He was late for his class, and it was just his luck that the door made a loud creak as he got in. All eyes were on him as he looked for an empty seat. He found one closest to him, but when he got there, someone had put a bag on it. He moved to another, and a bag was put on it, and so on. He found himself at the back of the class, which made him strain his eyes to see the board, despite his glasses on. Class ended, and Jerome stood up. At least he tried to, but the chair was glued to his trousers. He struggled to get up, but the class laughed at him. Tears welled in his eyes. It was his first day at school, and it was a tough one, from him being falsely accused to him being now glued to his chair. It wasn't even broken time yet. The week was slow for Jerome, filled with one problem. It seemed like everything was not going on in his favor. Pranks were being played on him in class, and the teachers ignored what was happening. Jackson and Peter, the bullies he had met on his first day, were the masterminds, and nobody did anything to confront them. While Jackson was the mayor's son, Peter's father was a judge, and they were deemed untouchable by the principal and teachers, who chose to turn a blind eye to their harassment of other students. "Don't worry, some new kid is going to come along, and they will ignore you," Jacob said. He had come to apologize to him after his first day. He knew if he hadn't lied, Jackson and Peter would bully him even more. Jerome had been bullied for most of the school year at his previous school. The divorce had worsened as his father had begun to date his principal. Moving here was supposed to be a new beginning, but the bullying had followed him. "Hey, Thread," Jackson said, pushing him against a locker. Jerome looked around. Every time Jackson bullied someone, it was like all the teachers and other students had disappeared. "What's in your bag today?" Jackson said, grabbing Jerome's bag. Peter emptied the bag and took Jerome's lunch and the money his mom had given him. "That's mine," Jerome said quietly. "What did you say?" Jackson asked as he pinched Jerome's cheek. The bullying continued for months, and Jerome reclined into a shell. He barely talked to anyone in school. He didn't speak to his mother at home. He was always afraid because of what Jackson and Peter did to him at school. There was no one to talk to because they would either not believe him or do anything about it. Jerome tried to keep it under the radar. He hid in the restroom during lunchtime. He hid until classes began before he got into class and hid behind in the class until everyone went home. The duo caught up with his escape plans and found a way to get through and bully him. One morning, a rumor went around the school that test questions had been stolen from the biology teacher's office. Mr. Donald had arrived at school early and found the test questions missing before the person could return them. The school board was investigating the theft. "Whoever committed this act will be expelled. I assure you, we will find you," the principal announced in assembly. The students filed back into the class as instructed. They were to remain in a class while an investigation took place. Jerome hurried to the bathroom stall to ease himself. It was when he was there that he'd heard two familiar voices. "They are going to find out we stole the test," Peter said with a shaky voice. "Shut up, stupid. They are not going to find out," Jackson said. But Peter was scared. "The janitor saw us in the hallway." Jackson scoffed. "He won't say a word. He knows my father will deal with him. Don't worry, I have it all sorted out. No one will believe we stole the results." Of course, they were the ones who stole the result, Jerome thought. He waited in the stall, contemplating if he should tell the principal what he knew, but decided not to. He could get into trouble if he told Mr. Scott. Besides, he didn't want Jackson and Peter to get into trouble. Yes, they bullied him, but he chose to see the good in them. His grandfather used to say, "Bullies are all tough and mighty, even on the outside, but on the inside they are just scared little kids who yearn for love." Even though they had been awful to him, he wasn't going to reveal their secret to anyone. During the second period, the principal and head of security came into the class. "Jerome, come with us," the principal said. "I don't know anything about the stolen tests," Jerome said. The principal and head of security said nothing as they led Jerome to his locker. Jerome gasped as they opened it. Inside was the stolen test results. "I knew you were trouble from the first day I set my eyes on you." "No, I didn't steal it," Jerome said in surprise. His defense fell on deaf ears. Even when he tried to tell the principal what he had heard, he refused to believe him. His mother picked him up. The ride back home was tranquil. She was disappointed in him. He was also disappointed in her for not believing him. He had never stolen. She knew him better than that. "You are grounded for 3 months," his mother said when they got home. He had been suspended while the school board held a disciplinary panel to decide on the appropriate punishment, but Jerome knew the result. He would be expelled. The principal had made it clear he had no future at McKinney High. The following day after his mother went to work, Jerome schemed. He was not going to be the fall guy for Jackson and Peter. They had not only bullied him, but they had also embarrassed him in front of his classmates. It was supposed to be a fun school year, but they had made it into a horrible year, with him about to be expelled. No one believed him, or instead they chose not to. It was up to him to prove his innocence. On Saturdays, Peter worked at an ice cream parlor owned by his uncle. Jerome stood by the counter, but had no intentions of ordering. "I know what you did," Jerome said. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said. I know you and Jackson stole the biology test, Jerome said. That's not true. You don't know what you're saying, Peter defended. Says who? I have proof of it on my phone. I was in the restroom, and I heard the two of you talking. Jerome smiled as Peter's face went pale. It wasn't my idea. It was Jackson. His father will send him to boarding school if he doesn't pass his exam. He was the one who stole the teacher's keys during lunchtime. I swear it wasn't me. Jerome had lied. He didn't have any proof on his phone, but with Peter giving Jackson away, Jerome recorded his confession on his phone. The following morning, while the disciplinary committee went on, Jerome appeared. You are not supposed to be here, the principal snapped when he saw Jerome. I'm here to exonerate myself, Jerome said before playing the recording. Peter was summoned before the committee, and with the evidence before him, he gave out his accomplice, Jackson, who had no other option but to confess. The following day, Jerome strolled into school with his shoulder held high and a confident smile. His classmates clapped on his back and hailed him for his actions. Jackson and Peter had been suspended, and the school board would no longer tolerate their bullying and bad behavior. Jerome knew he would have a fantastic school year from now on.
I was always different than the other girls. For one thing, I was dimmed less pretty than the other girls in my school, and they always thought I was more boyish than the rest of them. Another thing, maybe the most important thing, was that I could see light when I got angry and burn everything in my path. Funny how I always seemed to do that, both literally and figuratively. Standing in front of my classmates yet again, I was listening to their taunts. I felt myself heat up. This happened every time I was angry. She's so different from the rest. She's rather ugly, isn't she? I don't think any boy would go for a girl like that. Don't make her angry, or she'll come undone. You know they call her Dragon Girl. They started laughing at this statement. Sometimes I wonder if they thought I didn't have feelings just because I had special abilities. I felt the anger coursing through me as they kept speaking and making taunts in my direction. One of the girls pushed me and I fell back, hitting me behind on the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and yelled back at them. I couldn't stop myself, and I realized it before it was too late. I had consumed everything in my path. There was a lot of damage done, Mr. Kelly, I heard an officer say to someone standing beside me. I was covered with a towel as the siren sounded, and the firefighters filled surroundings around me. I heard my father grunt beside me, shaking his head in shame. His daughter had done it again, bringing dishonor to the family. He and my mother had always tried to change me, to make me a better person, but it never turned out the way they wanted it to. And who could blame them? I was the one that couldn't control my powers, not them. We're so sorry for the damage, I heard him say to the fireman beside him. Rest assured, we will pay for everything, and a generous donation will go to the school. Help everyone recover. He said the last bit quietly, and I knew what he meant. It was a bribe to keep their mouths shut. He didn't want anyone to find out about this. It would be bad for my father. He was one of the most prestigious businessmen in town. This wouldn't be good publicity for him. He shook hands with the man while I kept my head down, afraid to look into his disappointed face, because I knew he wore that expression as he spoke. It's time to go home, he said stiffly, placing a hand on my shoulder to direct me towards his car, parked not far away from the school's grounds. Your mother will be so disappointed, Grace. I winced. Using my middle name was always a way of communicating the disdain my parents sometimes felt for me. It always made me shiver. It meant things had gone terribly. I walked towards the passenger side of the car. I could feel the eyes looking at me intently. It was always unnerving because it never helped that I had crippling anxiety. I got into the car as quickly as possible, staring out of the window beside me. Luckily, the car was parked across the street from the school, and I didn't have to look at the school from my side of the vehicle. My dad got in and started the ignition, and his large form slumped down a bit when the car began to move away from the school. I knew he would say something soon, so I had to brace myself for it, but there was only silence, at least for a while. When we had gotten reasonably far from the school, he cleared his throat and slowed the sedan into the traffic in front of us. You know we always try our best to help you, but... he said with a defeated sigh as he turned to look at my face. I tried to turn away, but my father always felt some way about looking away from him when he spoke. I didn't have a choice but to look at him. But it's hard to take care of someone like you. He looked away, focusing on the road before him. I, on the other hand, turned to face the window again. I felt tears leak from my face furiously. It would always be like this. I would always be a freak. I was going to be someone like you to everyone around me. I didn't ask for these abilities. Sometimes I wish they would go away. But like everything that happens just before you go to bed, it's real and stays. You only get that moment you're sleeping to wish it away. But as soon as your eyes open, you'll be faced with the cruel truth. This was my cruel truth. I'm sorry, I whispered as I cried silently, hoping he didn't notice I was crying. I was probably unaware that we had already gotten home, but I realized it quickly once the car door swung open and I came face to face with my mother. She stood, tall and proud, just like her husband. I always felt a stark contrast between her and me when I stood beside her. She was elegant, a sophisticated woman that everyone looked up to, and I, on the other hand, was rough and always getting into trouble. I wasn't elegant. Hovering over me with my father next to her, my mother seized me up and shook her head furiously. How many times would this happen? She boomed, her voice holding the anger I had just let go of a couple of hours ago. Funny, that always seemed to be the only thing we had in common. It's not my fault, Mom, I said. They were teasing me. What have I said about that? I let out a sigh and repeated the words she had constantly drummed into my ears. I should always report to a teacher around me. And did you do that? She asked. I already knew where this was heading. They don't understand, Mom, I said, a little bit irritated. No one does. Well, you have to stop acting like a brat, and then maybe someone will pay you to heed. You're an awful person, found myself saying. My feet seemed to work on their own too. I found myself running out of the yard and into the streets beyond. My parents' cries for me to come back were lost in the sea of thoughts swimming in my head. I walked a long distance, taking a detour into the park, far from home, when I felt the need to stop and finally let it all out. I screamed as loud as I could into the empty park and finally cried, the tears falling nonstop. The sky seemed to call with me. There was a rumble and then a sudden downpour, sending me running for shelter under one of the oak trees. I huddled up, crying my eyes out. Why me? Why are all these things happening to me? I felt a presence next to me and quickly lifted my head. Well, if it isn't Miss Dragon Girl. A girl taunted me as she walked towards me. It was one of the teasers from my school that my blast hadn't injured. She came forward and a group of girls followed after. I don't want any trouble, I quivered, backing further into the tree. I didn't want to start anything with these girls. We know, she replied. Get her, girls. It happened at once, and before I knew it, the girls were all over me. They were kicking and hitting me as I lay immobile on the ground. I felt the anger in me rise, and my body began to heat up. As the beatings became more intense, then I realized I couldn't attack. This is what my mother had yelled about, what my parents had been talking about. There was no teacher to report to, but I had to stay in check, so I laid quietly, the pain increasing with each blow I was given. The girls began to laugh, and their leader said, "That's enough for today. She'll think twice about showing her ugly face around here ever again." The rain came down twice as hard as I laid bloody on the ground, the water washing over me. I kept thinking maybe this was it. I'd go into the light and never be bothered again, or perhaps they'd have to bother again. I felt a presence next to me. I didn't bother to look this time. I was sure it was one of the girls, back to do their dirty bidding. "Why are you on the floor?" a male voice called out. "Are you crying, or is it just the rain?" I didn't know who it was, but I didn't want anyone to see me in this state as I cried miserably. "Please leave me alone. They've already done their part," I yelled, but he chuckled. "You need a helping hand." He put his hand on mine, and I realized they were so warm. It was almost as if he had pulled them out of an oven. I looked up at his face and gasped. You're a dragon," I exclaimed. He laughed again, lifting me off the ground. He put his hands on my wounds, and I began to feel the pain go away. You're a smart one, aren't you? He said over the loud sounds of water hitting the ground. Let's get you somewhere dry. In an instant, the rain stopped. I looked around us, and it was still raining, but it wasn't coming anywhere near us. It just fell around us. I marveled at this, forgetting the incidents that had just occurred. I had never seen magic up this close. I've been watching you, he said. You're special. I'm not. I'm a freak, I replied, turning away from him to face the park around me. My eyes were still focused on the rain. You're not a freak, if that's what you're trying to tell me. I am, I said, a little bit annoyed as I began to heat up again. I hated that no one could understand me. I didn't realize it, but I was releasing smoke, and I let out a little roar, and fire erupted from my hands. See? This is what I'm talking about, I yelled, the fire growing in my hands. I'm a freak. I'm the dragon girl who can't keep herself in check. He stared at me for a while, contemplating something, then walked towards me, placing a hand on my shoulders. Maybe you're different and can't keep yourself in check, but you're not a freak, Grace. You need somebody that understands you. He turned towards the sky and let out a roar, fire flowing out of his mouth into the clouds above. Come on, you give it a try, he urged. You've got marvelous fire techniques. I let out a little awkward laugh. No one had ever said that to me before. I let out a roar and fire erupted. He continued to laugh as he rose to the air. I knew what was happening. He was transforming into a full dragon. I looked away. You weren't supposed to look at them when they transformed. After a bright light flashed, I knew he had changed. You're not so different, you know, he said again. I'm always here.
I was driving my car, minding my business, much like I did every Sunday. There is a stretch of road not far from where I live, blasting down it at speed, and watching the rolling hills and waves of leaves rush as my car tires hit them. Once upon a time, this was the highlight of my week. Now, it's just an awful memory and flashback that haunts me. One Sunday afternoon, I foolishly decided to take a different route that appealed to me. I took it, and looking back, I wish I hadn't. I went just a little tiny bit too quickly, leading to me spinning out a little. It was also a damp day. The rain had finished pouring from the sky earlier that morning, soaking everything in sight, especially the road, which didn't help in my case. I wasn't as good of a driver as I had initially thought. Even worse was that on the other side of the road, there was an oncoming car, which I somehow managed to collide directly into. Unsurprisingly, the man driving the vehicle wasn't happy, as his rather expensive and pristine Ferrari had just been violently dented by my crummy Ford Focus. Being a typical 17-year-old and growing up in southern England, I couldn't do much better, which, from the benefit of hindsight, was a good thing, as if I had been going any faster, I think I would have caused a lot more damage to my vehicle. The man wanted compensation, and he wanted it fast. Thousands and thousands were demanded, but I was far from able to pay, so he had resorted to his other, far worse for me choice. He threatened to summon me to court to sort it out there. Seeing as I was too immature and poor to sort this matter out on my own, as he had put it. I knew that he could not legally do this, though, so I stood my ground, scared out of my mind, but undefeated. Nobody dares to me like that. I was more than ready to take him on until it clicked. I had barely any money and no experience, but I needed a skilled and professional lawyer. Despite the damage done by my relatively small Ford Fiesta being minor, The man made a big deal out of it, and for all I knew, it could have escalated into me receiving criminal damage charges. I knew he had one of his friends to aid him, an experienced accident lawyer who could quickly and efficiently rip me to shreds at the click of a finger. And who did that leave me with? Nobody. But then again, I was more than used to this. An orphan like myself is an orphan for a reason, after all. The one thing I had going for me was a high-quality education, and although I knew almost nothing about my area's legal system, I knew that I was more than capable of learning the ins and outs before the court date had been told. Several weeks passed, and he continued to bug me, threatening me with court dates and his evidence folder, and telling me he would wring my already struggling bank account dry. I was terrified of what was to come at first, but by this point I was unfazed, knowing that I had learned quite a bit about the legal system. The anxiety I now faced had kept me from leaving my house for weeks to come, like I was trapped out of my mind as well as in it. So all that was left for me to do was study the traffic and accident laws of my area to increase my chances of success significantly. The anxiety began to fade as I read them over and over, taking down any notes that would help me, and then picking from them what would win this case. Now, all that was left was a little more procrastinating, just a few more weeks left to find my inner lawyer, which was looking more and more likely by the second. I had always been my best friend, so seeing myself through this challenging time and coming out on top was likely. The victory was definitely in my sights. Despite all the stress of the case, I still needed to live an everyday life and maintain a standard of living. But everything was intense and complex. Even a simple trip to the shop led to a spike in anxiety. It was like everyone was looking at me, fixating as I strolled past frantically, trying to pick up my groceries while encountering as few people as possible. How did they even know that I was in a court case? What business was it to them? The day before the court case arrived, I received a phone call to confirm the details. They were surprised I would rather defend myself than have someone do it for me. Surely I would want a free lawyer. No, honestly I wouldn't. I wanted to prove that I could stand my ground and fight my battles despite my background. The sour and rich older man cackled when he was made aware that I was on my own, but that was his downfall. His wealth clouded his judgment and led to his subsequent humiliation. Before I knew it, the day of the court case arrived, and I was scared. Scared was an extreme understatement of my emotions. The man stood, towering over the podium that he was put upon. He must have been at least 6'5", maybe closer to 7 feet. Now it wasn't just his persona that intimidated me. This giant man would indeed have me beaten physically, but in the court I was pretty confident he would lose to my knowledge. I was prepared and reminded myself of this as we headed into the court and sat at our respective tables, waiting for the judge to walk in. We stood up as he walked in, though I struggled to stand straight as my legs trembled beneath me, and sat down as the case began. The judge presiding was a more prominent man, though he had quite the cruel face, and the jury didn't look much friendlier either. However, I would be fine, and by the end of it, they would surely be on my side, after all the convincing arguments I had prepared for this case. The experienced lawyer stood no chance against me now. I was in my prime now. We argued back and forth, but I was no longer scared. I was empowered. I could now see more clearly the cloud of fear had been lifted. Due to this, I noticed the uproar of the jury whenever he spoke. They were seemingly on my side. As their moods changed, the lawyer the other man had hired began to look less confident and more like he was about to piss himself off as he realized he was losing. Seeing this was like fuel to the burning fire of confidence inside of me, and several times I had to hold back a smile from creeping onto my face. At last it was time. The jury began to file out of the room. One by one, they disappeared, and in 30 minutes they'd be back to tell me if I could have my life before or not. It was time for me to go on a break too. While I waited, but first I got to see the cracked caricature of the man, legs shaking and no eye contact made. He was nervous and doing a terrible job of hiding it from view. It was a sight I enjoyed immensely, very much, quite an amusing thing to see. It lifted my spirits as the anxiety I was feeling made me want to burst into tears, but the happiness helped me hold it back as we waited for recess. The minutes passed slowly. 1,800 seconds felt like 1,800,000. As the jury reconvened in the other room, I could feel my life slip past me. But when they returned, I sat up straighter, waiting anxiously for the verdict of this case. This would determine the rest of my life. I don't know how I could cope if I lost this trial. I waited with intensely bated breath for the judge to speak. His cruel face stared down at me, and he began to talk about my fate. After much debate, the jury and I have come to a mutual conclusion that the defendant is not guilty and that no fees must be paid for the accidental damage inflicted upon the Ferrari by the defendant's car. I had never thought I would win in a million years, but it was like a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I could finally relax after all this time, go out and see my friends without his army of followers harassing me wherever I went. The relief was utterly indescribable, and the joy after, as the judge told me that the man I had crashed into would have to pay me compensation for the damage instead. It was more significant than anything that I had ever felt before.
A ray of sunshine broke through a small gap between the gray curtains and blinded Mary. She hadn't slept in a long time because her stepfather came home late from work, and, as usual, he lectured his mother for a long time. Mary never understood why her mother chose to marry this ugly and intrusive man, and she had 4 children with him, her younger sisters and brothers. Her mother was a kind and gentle woman, but very soft, and she could not resist her husband. All Mary knew about her father was that he was the first love of a very young Jessica and left the day she found out Jessica was pregnant. Mary didn't want to get up because she didn't sleep and had to work all day. After graduating high school, her stepfather put her in the store as an assistant. Mary liked to study, but Harry Thompson did not want to pay for her further education. The girl dreamed of becoming a designer. She painted well that even school teachers often sent her work to competitions. On the shelf among the school notebooks and books, Mary had letters of thanks that she was very proud of. Her mother quietly went into her daughter's room and practically gestured that she needed to get up. Mary dressed, cleaned herself up, and caught a glimpse of her weariness and lack of sleep. Avoiding her stepfather, she burrowed into the kitchen, swallowed a sandwich, said goodbye to her mother, and left the apartment. The street was sunny and quite warm, despite September. The shop in which she worked was a 30-minute walk away. Mary took her time because she had a decent time. She strolled, thinking about everything, when suddenly she remembered that she had left her phone at home. She didn't want to come back, but she needed the phone too because, in between jobs, she managed to listen to a free intensive course for aspiring designers. Yet, deep down, Mary never gave up her dream of becoming a designer, so she decided to come back. The girl walked back so quickly that she ran into a young man who had just muttered in response to Mary's apology. Out of breath, she called the apartment, whose door could not open for a long time. Her stepfather was already asleep. Her mother was gathering the children for school. Mary grabbed the phone and ran to work. Mr. Alford, the clothing and shoe store owner, took a hard look at the late Mary, but said nothing. The girl slipped into the staff room and quickly changed her clothes. Her task was to keep the store clean and help the sellers. The store was on a busy street, so there were many visitors, and Mary ran between the clothing and shoe counters from morning to evening. So she came across one of her clients and thought she'd seen this man somewhere before. It was a young guy from the street who she ran into in a hurry and who seemed to recognize her too. He smiled and said, Hey, can you stop knocking me down? Mary was very embarrassed and blushed, but she didn't say anything. It must be noted that she was always embarrassed when young people paid attention to her, although she was beautiful. Blue eyes, white skin, and a proper nose gave her face a nice look. But she didn't even dare look at the young man and went to the other side of the hall. What a surprise it was when, after work, she saw that guy again at the door. Now he was embarrassed and barely heard him say, "I'm sorry, but can I walk you home?" Mary was embarrassed again and said nothing, heading towards the house. The young man followed her. "Don't think about it. I have no evil thoughts. I just liked you very much. I was afraid you would leave, so I waited for you. My name is Ryan. What's your name again?" Mary knew it was wrong to meet on the street, but she gave her name without knowing why. That was the beginning of their acquaintance. Ryan was now waiting for Mary the evening after work, and they went for a walk through the darkening streets. Mary learned that Ryan worked for a management company and that he was the only son in the family. The young people soon became mutually sympathetic. For Mary, their meetings were an outlet where she could take her mind off family matters. She was already dreaming of leaving her home, where there was little room for her because of her stepfather. They could talk about anything with Ryan, and they seemed to understand each other with half a word. And then the day came when Ryan met Mary and invited her to a cafe near the store. As soon as they sat down at the table, he made a small order and looked at Mary very significantly as soon as the waiter left. The girl was surprised, but did not say anything. "Dear Mary, you and I have known each other for 3 months. That's not enough to get to know each other. I love you." Mary blushed. Tears came out, and through them she whispered, "Me too." 2 months later, Mary and Ryan were married. The wedding was modest in the same cafe where the proposal was made. Only the closest and most few friends came. The young people first rented an apartment, but after a while, they took out a loan and bought a small, cozy apartment on a quiet street. Mary couldn't believe her happiness. At last, she is her mistress, without a grumpy and rude stepfather who counts every penny and never lets go of anything to reproach Mary and her mother. Mary had furnished her family's nest, although at first they lived very modestly, but the apartment was always clean, cozy, and smelled delicious. A year later, their son Mark was born, which Mary doted on. Amid her maternal feelings, Mary seems to have missed something in her relationship with her husband. Ryan was coming home more and more late than usual. He stayed with friends and went out on Sunday night with his buddies. At first, Mary did not pay much attention to this, explaining it to her husband's fatigue and workload. But one day, Ryan returned and confessed that he'd been fired from his job. From that moment on, a dark chapter in their life together began. Ryan refused to look for a new job, believing that he had been unfairly fired, and feeling sorry for himself for a long time. Mary was very supportive of him, but soon realized that the reason was that he didn't want to work. 2 months later, he just got used to living like this, and Mary was woefully short of money to support herself and her son. The funds provided by the state was not enough, and she stopped expecting support from her husband. 6 months had passed. Mary was relatively low, and then she decided to find a job. She left that job when her son was born, and finding a new one wasn't easy because she didn't have an education. She also had to leave the baby with someone. Ryan was afraid to keep the baby. Her mother was living with 4 children, and Ryan's parents, it turned out, were not keen on participating in the lives of their son and grandson. And yet, Mary got her mother to sit with Mark for a couple of hours while her stepdad was at work. And she was running around the organizations and offices asking that she be taken at least a cleaner. But they did not want to take this position. And, having completely despaired, she crossed the threshold only to open Hotel Monroe. She was met in the hall by a female administrator who told her that they only wanted cleanup girls who were responsible and decent. Mary agreed and was sent to the manager, who turned out to be a lovely young man. He listened attentively to Mary and, for some reason, felt a great deal of sympathy for her and decided that it would be okay if she were accepted as a maid. Mary seemed to him to be a friendly and tidy girl. Happy and satisfied, Mary was walking home. For some reason, she felt a new life was beginning for her. Ryan wasn't home. His mother said he'd gone away in a car, and she packed up and rushed home. Mary put her son to bed and went to sleep herself. In the middle of the night, she heard a noise and voices outside the door. Mary opened the door and saw her husband's friends, Tom and Brian. "Mary, don't worry, it's not that bad." This made Mary nervous and dizzy. "Ryan was in a car accident. He hit a man on the street. Now he's at the police station." "Dead?" Mary whispered with her white lips. "What?" Tom didn't get it. "Hit him to death?" asked Mary, afraid to hear the answer. "No, but a man with a concussion, broken arm and leg." Mary breathed a sigh of relief, though she felt it was a temporary relief and all the difficulties lay ahead. She asked a neighbor to look after her son and went to the station. Ryan sat with his head down and was interrogated, but was released in the morning. Mary didn't ask him about the details of the accident. According to the coroner, Ryan was responsible for the accident, hit another car, and drove to the side of the road. The man was also walking in the wrong direction, but it didn't diminish Ryan's guilt. "What are we going to do?" Ryan asked Mary in confusion, as if she were the one who should know the answer. "Let us break through," answered his wife, and everything trembled with anxiety inside her. A series of interrogations, calls to the station, and meetings with a lawyer. The victim, the man, did not want to meet with Ryan and his lawyer and asked for possible and unthinkable amounts of physical and moral damage. Even if Mary and Ryan had sold everything, they wouldn't have that kind of money. Money was sorely lacking. Mary borrowed money from everyone who could help her, but it wasn't enough. They were waiting the court's final decision, which would determine how much to pay to the aggrieved man. It was Ryan's day to make amends, almost as good as their apartment. They had to make a decision. No one could help them. Mary was sitting on the couch. Her face was stone. Ryan dared not even look at his wife. After a profound silence, he said, "We need to sell the apartment. Part of the amount will be used to repay the loan, and most of the money will have to be paid to Manson, the victim's name." Mary was silent. She had nothing to say. She knew Ryan had no other choice. At that moment, she hated him for his cowardice, laziness, and infantility. "What about Mark and me? Where are we going to live? Have you thought about that?" "But I have no other options. Otherwise, I will be put in prison. Do you want this? Of course, you would live here at your pleasure, and I sit behind the cage," he cried out. "You hit a man. You're to blame," said Mary. "Where am I going with my son? We have no savings, only debts." Mary went into the kitchen and cried. She seemed more miserable and miserable than ever. And Mark, her poor child, will wander in search of a home. But very soon Mary came to her senses. She was always strong, and she will not give up now. "Okay, sell the apartment. Only I have a condition. I am filing for divorce. I will not live with a man who has traded family for friends and poker. You refused to work when I was running around town begging for a job, and you were driving around the city with your buddies. I feel condemned and my son to poverty." Ryan stared at Mary with disbelief. A month later, they divorced in court. Ryan sold the apartment, paid a fine, and disappeared. Mary was left with her son in her arms on the street. Her mother felt sorry for her and called her home, but as soon as her stepfather saw Mary and Mark at home, he said, "You stay here tonight, and tomorrow you'll be gone. I don't need more mouths in this house." All night Mary did not sleep, and in the morning left Mark with her mother and went to work in Monroe. Without looking at anyone, she went to the manager's office and knocked on the door. "Yes, come in," said a familiar voice. "Mr. Castle, I have a challenging situation. I have no place to live with my son. If you let me and my child stay temporarily in the hotel, I can work overtime. Then I will solve the housing issue." Mr. Castle listened very carefully to Mary, and she cried. She had not called since that episode in the kitchen. She held on as best she could. "I'm sorry, it's my nerves." "Well, Mrs. Brooke, I'll make sure you have a room." Mary left with confidence. At least for a while, they will have a roof over their head, and there she will get out. The next day, Mary moved into a small room, which was a staff room. There was one big bed, a table, and a wardrobe. Nothing else could fit there, but Mary was pleased about that too. She was helped by sympathetic maids who looked after her son. A month had passed. One day she had a phone call. It was Ryan. He was drunk and demanded to see his son. He promised to sue for a time to see him. Mary's attempts to talk him out of it didn't help. "If you don't want to give me your son, then pay me the money," he shouted. Mary knew her son didn't want to see his father, so she said, "Okay, I'll only pay you if you disappear from our lives." "I promise," said the ex-husband. Mary hung up and wondered where she would get the money to pay off her hateful ex-husband. Mr. Castle, she thought. Mary realized it was risky to use the manager's kindness, but there was no way out. She decided to ask him for money and get away from Ryan forever. At that moment, someone knocked on their room door. "Come in," said Mary, in surprise, and even more surprised to see Mr. Castle at the door. What a coincidence, she thought. "I was passing by and thought I'd see how you were settling in," said the manager calmly. "Thank you. Well, thanks to you," said Mary, embarrassed. "You don't need anything, Mr. Brooke?" No, we have everything." "Why do you look worried?" "Yes, it is echoes of the past. The ex-husband asks for money, so he does not demand to see his son, and I do not want him to have his influence on him." It was in Mary's mind to ask about the money, but she didn't say anything, and the manager probably didn't think it was polite to ask her if she had any money. He glanced at the wall above the bed and saw a collage of superheroes on the wall. Mary was drawing this so that her son wouldn't be so bored. Mary caught his eye. "Mr. Castle, if it's too much, I'll wipe it all down. The paint's off easy." No, it's wonderful." After another minute, the manager said goodbye and left. The next day, after cleaning the rooms, Mary hurried down the hall to her room, when suddenly she was called and told that the manager was waiting for her in the office. Mary was alarmed, thinking it was about the painted wall. She entered the manager's office. Her fears were partially justified, but that's not what Mr. Castle was saying. "Mrs. Brooke, I appreciate your artistic ability and would like to suggest that you do the same with the wall in the children's playroom on the second floor of our hotel. Of course, the payment will be different than the one you received as a maid. Do you agree?" "Mr. Castle, but I have absolutely no artistic training, and I'm not sure—" "Mrs. Brooke, do you agree or not?" "Yes," said Mary. For a whole week, Mary had been testing her art muse, and by the admission of many, everything worked out perfectly. The children's room became lively and colorful thanks to Mary's drawings. Her work was well paid for, and she paid off her husband, who called her almost every day. Having seen Mary's talent, the manager offered her a place as a decorator at the hotel. Mary agreed because it was her dream to become a designer. It was hard to start, but she could do it. She worked even at night. She was learning in parallel. Mark grew up. Mary took him to kindergarten. They left the hotel room when they were better off with the money. Mary rented an apartment near her mother so she could come to her daughter comfortably. Thus, day after day, difficult times and painful memories faded into the past. Now, every day was bright for Mary. Happiness with its warm rays touched her face. Good things were beginning in her life and continued. Soon, she went from Mrs. Brooke to Mrs. Castle, but that's a different story.